So, thank you for coming back after the coffee break. After the first wonderful session, I would like to say also thank you very much. It's so impressive to have so many students, early career scholars, future scholars, and so on here among us. I think this is wonderful to look into this audience. Our next speaker cannot be with us. She is sick. As far as I heard. That's why it is very, very nice of her to join us at least online. So thank you very, very much. Paola Mollo is a professor of Hebrew language and literature here at the Pontifical Biblical Institute, and she is Dean of the Faculty of Ancient Near Eastern Studies. She was a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the Università Sapienza in Rome, and here at the Biblicum, conducting a project on the semantics of motion and posture verbs in Biblical Hebrew and its ancient translations. Among her publications, there is very interesting for our topic also, The Motive of Generational Change in the Old Testament, a literary and lexicographical study. I am looking forward to your paper, God in Motion and at Rest. And again, thank you very much for joining us in this way. Did you hear me? I think you can start now, but I fear.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? And
I think this is now.
And
everything is okay. So the floor is yours.
Okay. I cannot. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. I cannot see your the image from the class, but I guess you can hear me. So thank you very much for also having made possible this connection. I'm sad not to be there, and of course not to listen to the other speakers. Is it okay? Connection?
So we can hear you.
Okay, I have a kind of, my voice comes back to me after some seconds.
Yeah, this is not very nice. So here, for us, everything is very well.
See? Okay, I try. Okay. So in my paper, I will try not to I will not venture beyond the borders of my field of research and teaching, which is primarily Biblical Hebrew. Nor will I go beyond the boundaries of the Hebrew Biblical Canon. However, from within this corpus and its linguistic system, which is quite different, quite far, of course, from that of Greek, I will attempt to highlight examples and stylistic features of how God is portrayed in the Bible through language, especially in relation to the space shared with human beings. In a conference exploring discourse on the divine from classical Greece through the early centuries of the Christian era and the New Testament, Septuagint, and Hellenistic Jewish literature, my contribution aims to provide a frame of reference and maybe even of contrast regarding the beginning based on the God of Israel in the Hebrew Bible, which, as we will see, is by no means flat or homogeneous. The title I have chosen, God in Motion and at Rest, presupposes that the God of the Hebrew Bible has a body, and that this idea is expressed in the biblical text as a matter of course. But what conceptual divine body emerges from the biblical texts? What form and substance are attributed to God? What is the physical relationship between the divine and the human? In his monograph, The Bodies of God and the Word of Israel, Homer explores the various ways in which God is represented in the Bible. In particular, he highlights how the Bible does not represent a single way, does not present a single way of representing the divine, but rather alternative and even conflicting conceptions and representations, sometimes coexisting side by side. This can be explained by two main factors. First, the evolution of the divine conception throughout the various stages of the Bible's composition. Second, the possible cultural influence of the Mesopotamian and Canaanite contexts, in which deities are understood as having multiple corporeal manifestations and fluid, not always clearly defined identities. Unlike, in contrast, the Greek pantheon, in which the deities had precise manifestations and identities that were consistently distinct from each other. Whatever the main reason may be, the Hebrew Bible contains passages that clearly allude to a resemblance between the divine and human beings, or rather, conversely, between human beings and the God who created them. Genesis 1, 26, 27 is maybe the best known example. Here we read, then God said, let us make humankind in our image, Betzalmenu, according to our likeness, Kidmutenu. So God created humankind in his image, in the image of God he created them. As Sommer notes, this passage speaks to us of a form, a divine image, according to which human beings are fashioned. However, it does not explicitly state that this form also possesses a material substance, something comparable to flesh and to the physical components of human beings. This conception, which Sommer calls non-material anthropomorphism, is found in all those biblical passages that describe the divine body primarily in terms of exceptional dimensions, absence of defects, such as the aging of organs, light, power, energy. According to this conception, God's body has form of matter. Indeed, the Bible never goes so far as to speak of God's flesh, basar, even though due to a misreading of the Hebrew text and the Hebrew verb sur, the Septuagint speaks of God's sarx, flesh, in Hosea 9:12. Nor is there in the Bible any mention to the fact that he possesses skin, bones, blood, internal organs, tongue, lips, with the exception of Isaiah 30:27, belly and fat. That is, all those parts of the body associated with the changeability, fragility, and perishability of human nature. However, it is well known that the God of the Bible, just like human beings, has a face, eyes, eyelashes, ears, nostrils, a mouth, teeth, legs, feet, and fingers. That is, the parts primarily associated with perceptual, communicative, and motor functions, which allow for a representation in human form of divine intervention in the world. These parts and organs are referred to in Hebrew by the same terms used for the human body, indicating that there is no actual difference in form and in function. Furthermore, unlike humans, and similarly to the seraphim and the cherubim, the biblical God possesses wings, the kerapaim, following the model of certain deities of the ancient Near East. Curiously, however, it is assumed that he has no left side or left hand, whereas his mighty and righteous right hand is well attested, especially in poetry and in song. You have here a list, and as well as his right side, where his beloved ones sit. So we can see, for example, in Exodus 15:6, your right hand, Yemincha, Lord, was majestic in power, your right hand shattered the enemy. And the same in Psalm 110, the Lord says to my Lord, sit to my right until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Alongside this this immaterial view of the divine body that is human in form but without physical substance, Sommer also argues that the Bible reflects a kind of material anthropomorphism. Namely, the belief, and I'm quoting, the belief that God's body, at least at times, has the same shape and the same sort of substance as a human body, end quote. A real body, therefore, that allows God to produce breath and to breathe into the nostrils of the first human, like in Genesis 2:7, to place a hand in his side and extract a rib, 2:21, and to be in a physical space shared with humans, make the sound of his footsteps heard, and to enjoy the cool breeze, like in Genesis 3:8. Therefore, the biblical description of God's features varies depending on the texts and traditions, between idealized manifestations, which exalt the superhuman and cosmic aspects of divinity, and entirely concrete and human manifestations. The following examples I propose will illustrate the range of possibilities and how they sometimes intertwine within hybrid and complex representations. I've chosen as an example, Psalm 18, verses 7, 17, in the Greek text is 6:16, and this same praise, in this same poetry is also present in 2 Samuel 22, 7, 17. This theophany of Psalm 18, God is depicted fundamentally through human features and attributes, like, for example, the ability to hear. We read in verse 6, he heard, Shama, and the ability to feel anger, so emotions, in verse 7, haralo. He has ears, nostrils, and feet, and also a hand is implied in the last verse, in verse 16, where God draws out and saves David from the deep waters. These human features, however, are associated in this text with the superhuman powers of cosmic space, of cosmic scope. God manifests himself through earthquake, so in verse 7, causes smoke to pour from his nostrils, and spits out fire and burning coals from his mouth, verse 8, just as occurs during a volcanic eruption. Even his descent to earth departs from human-like representations. He does not use his feet to walk, but rather bends the vault of heaven and is carried, gliding, by a thick cloud positioned beneath him. Verse 9. In verse 10, he is described as moving on the backs of the cherubim, winged angelic beings, through whom he flies and flies swiftly on the wings of the wind. God's human features seems to be entirely set aside when his appearance is described in verses 11 and 12. Here, the conception of God as an extremely luminous being comes to the fore. In verse 12, 11 for the Greek text, we have the term noga, which is brightness. Elsewhere, the deity, the God, is represented in the form of fire, ash, or karnaim, blazing rays. As the encounter between God and Moses in Exodus 33 teaches us, this brightness is not only blinding to the human eye, but also deadly. Just remember the episode in Judges 13 and Isaiah 6:5. For this reason, the luminous God, in revealing himself to the man, in verse 11, hides his appearance, covering himself all around with darkness, masses of water, and thick clouds. Even his voice, which in many biblical passages sounds human and comprehensible to mortal ears, is described in verse 13 as a roar, a thunderclap coming from the sky along with hail and lightning. More concise is the epiphany described in Micah 1, 3, and 4. Look, the Lord is coming from his dwelling place. He comes and treads on heights of earth. Then he melt under him, and the valleys will burst open like rocks near the fire, like waters poured down in steep place. The Lord's movement is described here, especially in verse 3, using verbs that are commonly associated with human motion. Yetza, which is about, Yad, to tread, but also to trample, dance, or to... For a moment, I'd like to focus on the third of these verbs of motion, darach. The terms, sorry, I have to do this. Yes, terms which means to tread, to trample, to advance, and to march. And this verb is rarer, of course, than the other two, and is not part of the basic Hebrew vocabulary. This verb emphasizes a particular way of moving, namely walking with a sure step, treading on the surface over which one moves. In fact, in a technical sense, it is also used in Biblical Hebrew to indicate the trading of grapes and olives. Like in Micah 6:15, we can read, "You shall tread darach olives, but not anoint yourself with oil. You shall tread darach grapes, but not drink wine." Or the same verse, the same verb is used also to describe an army's march on enemy or occupied territory, like in chapter 5, 4 and 5. The Assyrians will come into our land and tread darach upon our soil or within our border. Therefore, the choice of this verb in the Epiphany of Micah 1:3 is intended to describe God's arrival in terms comprehensible to human experience, portraying him as a victor marching with heavy steps across the territory he intends to punish or occupy, the heights of the earth. At the same time, however, even this very human verb can take on, when attributed to God, a non-literal transcendent nuance. The earth, the refer both to physical and historical places, namely the highlands where cults unpleasing to the God of Israel were practiced, and also in poetic terms to the mountains in general. Mountains which, in merism with the valleys mentioned in verse 4, conventionally represent the entire surface of the earth. So the Lord is someone who steps on the mountains and the valleys, that is, on the entire earth. This second interpretation, both poetic and cosmic, is consistent with other instances of the verb darach when applied to God. In these passages, in addition to mountains, like here in Micah 1:3 and also in Amos 4:13, God's trampling takes place upon another primordial and foundational element of the world, the waters, which God apparently crosses on foot in Job 9:8, who alone trampled the waves of the sea, or on horseback in Habakkuk 3:15, you trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great waters. Therefore, while using terms that superficially recall common human experience, that is, to go out, to descend, to tread the grapes, or to march, the epiphany we encounter in Micah 1:3 and 4 refers both directly and indirectly to the repertoire of topoi and stylistic elements that describe the descent of the deity to earth. Among these, we note the involvement of cosmic elements, the subversion of nature, mass punishment, and the image of the divine warrior. As mentioned at the outset, the parts of the body with which God is endowed are those that are strictly functional to his relationship with human beings, namely the mouth, so that he may communicate with them, the sensory system, hearing, sight, touch, and even smell, so that he may perceive them, and finally the motor system, so that he may reach out to them and accompany them in their lives. Regarding the latter, the motor system, which is the focus of this contribution, there is a significant characteristic of the divine. God's motion is described almost exclusively as relational. That is, in the Bible, God seems to move almost always in relation to humanity and its affairs. The verbs of motion which typically describe humans moving from one place to another, such as verb bo, halach, ala, yarad, sur, avar, and shuv, appear, though not very frequently, in relation to God when he moves to reach, to accompany, guide, or abandon humanity. On the other hand, instances in which the deity is described as moving for its own sake, that is, detached from the world in a special realm not shared with humanity, are truly sporadic. Among the very few examples identified in the Bible, I'm going to cite here two passages. One is Psalm 47:6. Both of these passages have the verb, which is a kind of transcending verb. In verse in Psalm 47, shout of joy of the midst of trumpets. We don't have it in the human word. And Psalm 68, more or less the same, ascend high, you took many captives, received gifts from the okay. So sorry. Just to mention, I was mentioning two passages where the deity is described not in relation with humanity. So among the verbs of motion, usually we have verbs which connect the deity with the human or earthly world. But we have a few passages, just a few passages, which involve heavenly motions of God, not in relation with the human beings. And just to mention these two psalms, Psalms 47:6, God has ascended with verb Allah, and Psalm 68, you ascended on high, lamarom. Where we have this term high and also the verb shakan, which denote a dwelling or abiding in high and not so detached in some way from humanity. Curiously, however, apart from these two occurrences here, there are no depictions of the movement of God upward, toward heaven. In fact, the few times the verb ala, which means to go up usually, the few times this verb is used in reference to God, it actually describes a movement of departure along a horizontal rather than a vertical axis to take leave of a human being after having finished speaking with him. For example, in Genesis 17:22 that you see, we have, and when he had finished talking with him, God departed from Abraham. So here the occurrence of Allah plus me'al has to be intended as a departure and not as a going up. In fact, the combination of the verb Allah and the compound preposition min al, me'al, indicates in Hebrew the meaning of to leave, depart, or withdraw from, and is usually used in reference to people or groups of people, including armies, who are moving away from a place where they had been up to that point, without any special reference to moving upward. As for these verbs, the Septuagint sometimes, or in this construction, Allah plus me'al, the Septuagint sometimes renders this construction with aperkomai and apotreko, conveying hence the sense of a horizontal moving away, whereas for the movement of God's departure, so here in Genesis 17:22 and also 35:13, it prefers anabaino, introducing a vertical direction which is absent in the Hebrew. While, as we have seen, the biblical God is almost never depicted as ascending to the place where he dwells, his descents to earth, on the other hand, are very, very frequent. The vertical axis connecting him to humanity, therefore, is far more frequently traversed in a downward direction than in an upward one, especially when the deity has an important message to convey or when his salvific intervention becomes necessary for the individual, the people, or all of humanity. The axis perpendicular to the ground that connects the human sphere to the divine is effectively described in Jacob's dream in Bethel, in Genesis 28, where angels of God, one of the forms in which the divine manifests to humanity in the Bible, are seen as ascending and descending a ladder that unites heaven and earth. So we read in verse 12, he had a dream in which he saw a starway resting on the earth with its top reaching to the heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. In this account, Jacob perceives God's presence as so real that he feels himself in a liminal space between the human and the divine, a place where, according to him, Adonai is present, a place that is dreadful and awesome, which he does not hesitate to recognize as the house of God, Bet Elohim, from which also the name of the place, Bethel, and as the gate of heaven, Sha'ar HaShamayim, which is the only occurrence of this expression in the Hebrew Bible. The verb used to describe divine descent, to communicate with humanity, or to rescue it, is yarad, a verb commonly used to refer to human movement downward. At times, yarad appears as a specific term for divine theophanies and epiphanies, such as those found in Psalm 18 that we have seen before, in verse 10, and Micah in verse 3, Micah 1 in verse 3, usually accompanied by earth-shattering effects on the cosmos and an appearance of God in a superhuman form. In other cases, however, it describes, the verb yarad describes a seemingly more ordinary and less startling descents, such as when God decides to come down to earth to observe human activity firsthand. We have a couple of examples. In Genesis 11, we read that the Lord came down, yarad, to Babel, to see the city and the tower that the people were building. And another case is Genesis 18:21, where the Lord says, I will go down, yarad, to Sodom and Gomorrah, and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that reached me. Or in other cases, in the instances when God descends upon Mount Sinai to meet Moses, in Exodus 19 in particular, and let's read together verse 20. And the Lord descended Yarah to the top of the Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up. As this example shows, for the encounter between the divine and the human, the former must descend, and vice versa, the latter must ascend, Allah. So we have the two motions to create a meeting. A final example illustrates yet another way in which God's care for creation and human destiny is expressed. In Psalm 113, verses 5 and 6, this is a Hallel psalm, the ancient motive and conception of the King of Heaven and Lord of the universe appears, who seated on a throne on high looks down upon the world below him. Can read, who is like the Lord our God, the one who sits enthroned on high, the one who looks far down on the heavens and the earth. The depiction of God in this case is not in motion but static. His dwelling is situated on high, where the deity sits as if on a throne. Here we have this interesting expression in Hebrew, Hamagili Lashevet, which is an elegant and even archaic linguistic construction, which combines the act of sitting with verb yashav and the act of acting and the verb of acting on high, gabah. However, his involvement with the earthly world is ever present, and it is expressed through the image of his gaze turned downward, Hamashpili Lirot, with a similar linguistic structure placed in parallel with verse 5b, which combines the act of seeing, with that of acting below, shafal. This is a much more solemn and static image of the deity who bridges the vertical distance between himself and creation with the force of an action that is as powerful as it is this time absolutely immobile. Around this image of the God who sits, yashav is the key verb, various forms of epithets develop, the most recurrent of which is the one who sits enthroned on the cherubims or between cherubim. And here we have a list of these epithet. This former, the one who sits enthroned between or on the cherubim, represents the static version of the image encountered before in Psalm 18:11, where God's swift descent was described as riding, rahar, or galloping at full speed on the cherubim and the wings of the wind. To conclude, there are still many examples that could be cited to illustrate the ways in which God interacts with humanity according to the narrative, poetic, and prophetic discourse of the Bible in its original language. Through movement, space, and bodily imagery, we have traced some of its main patterns and motives. Looking for the appearance or appearances of the body and the bodily functions of God in the Bible has given us insights into the underlying ideas of the divine in these texts. Analyzing verbs and expressions of motion and posture linked to God, especially in contrast with humans, offered a useful picture of how he is represented. As the examples have shown, these patterns are quite frequent in the Bible. Usually one element stays the same, while another is modified, reworked, or adapted. This interaction between repetition and innovation, typical of all types of discourse, is clearly represented also in the biblical discourse on God in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, I thank you for the attention, and I'm open to questions. Thank you.
The next paper is by Professor Camillo Neri from the University of Bologna. He teaches Greek language and literature in Bologna, works on Greek poetry, for example, women poetry, historiography, philosophy, biblical exegesis, humanities and computing, peace education, and so on and so on. And I think many topics to talk about. He has been director of Dipartimento di Filologia Classica e Medievale at the University of Bologna, was co-founder of Dipartimento di Filologia Classica e Italianistica, member of the international team of the Année Philologique, many other editorial boards, and I have a whole list of fascinating publications, book publications related to all these topics. So I think a lot of things to read, but not a lot of things to read during your paper. We are looking forward to your presentation, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Professor Nicklas. Thank you, Daniela and Paola, for this invitation. You will regret it. A very small thing full of uncertainties, and studied by so poor English-speaking scholar, old scholar. So, haben Sie Geduld. I'm so sorry, but you are aware now. In the so-called Book of Promises, among those oracles dating back to the end of the 8th century, that is, to the 4th period of Isaiah prophetic activity, the most recent part of chapter 29, 15 to 24, which celebrates, selon la Bible de Jérusalem, le triomphe du droit, even for the poor and the wretched, ends with a difficult verse, number 1 in your handout, no, in your digital handout. The Kola arrangement in Hebrew and Greek, and the translation here and afterwards are mine, my responsibility. Ve'yodu toe ruach bina ve'rognim ilmedu lekach. And the wandering spirits shall know intelligence, and the grumblers will learn instruction. The phrase, which has parallels in Deuteronomy 1:27, va te rognu, the Greek as kai diegonguzete, and in Psalm 106:25, va ye rognu, kai gongusan, for the murmuring of grumblers, does not present any significant textual problems, and has been investigated mainly for the value of the participial unicum rognim, from a rare verb which in Deuteronomy and in Psalm indicates the murmuring of the Hebrews who fled Egypt, and which occurs four more times in Proverbs to indicate slanderer, and of the conclusive LXX, which in Deuteronomy 32:2 indicates a divine teaching dripping like rain. In Proverb 1:5, the wisdom increased by the wise man who listens, and again in Proverb 7:21, the dangerously persuasive words or gifts of the foreign adulteress. The Latin of Hieronymus translates et scienterrantes spiritu intellectum, voilà, et mussitatores discent legem, an exegetical translation with the verbal unicism mussitatores and the exegetic one legem, already splendidly illustrated by Paolo Serrazanetti in 1989. The Septuagint, however, renders with a tricolon, which adds a third segment with no corresponding Hebrew to a substantially faithful two-membered structure. Kai gnosontai oi to pneumati planomenoi synesin, oi de gonguzontes mathesontai upakuein, kai ai glossai ai psellithusai mathesontai lalein eirenen. Again, the text of the first two cola does not present any particular problems, except for the different Greek translation of the two difficult terms, rognim and LXX. Symmachus, for example, as, kai gnosontai, mathesontai, their codex, oi peplanemenoi topneumati, synesin, kai gongustai, mathesontai paideian. Aquila as lempsin, Theodotion epidoken for upakuein. This third colon, which has no equivalent in Hebrew, was already obelized by Origen, with therefore read it in all his manuscripts. By Jerome, quodque sequitur et lingue balbuzientes discent loqui pacem, obelo prenotandum est, as well as by the Vaticanus, the Marcalianus, the Syro-Hexapleric version, and some minuscule codices. And the reference editor, Ziegler, 1983, resorted to the squares of the spunction, in innovation with respect to the cautious Ralphs and with more deference perhaps to Origen's ipse dixit. Commentators and scholars usually limited themselves to noting the plus della 70, so Serrazanetti. The very recent Penner, 2020, does not address the issue, neither in the text, where a tethesis is not marked, nor in the commentary. There is no sign of excision and no commentary either in Le Boluec Le Moigne 2014, yes, a kind of Pax Origeniana. The reason for the athetesis are obvious. The Greek plus recurs almost identically, but this time with its Hebrew counterpart, within another long section of Vus, chapters 30-33, to seal the small glimpse of hope, 32:1-4, dedicated to the celebration of the Roi Juste, Bible de Jérusalem, who will reign in justice, peace, and harmony. Number 2 in your handout. Okay. Ulevav nimcharim yabin ledat, u leshon illegim temacher ledaber tzachot. And the earths of the breathless will be able to know, and the tongue of the stammerers will struggle to speak clearly. The complex Hebrew sequence, where the term indicating stutterers, illegim, is an absolute apex, and the final clear, also expressed by a rare and disputed term, tzakot, should perhaps be expunged, metri gratia, so Biblia Ebraica Stuttgartensia, is in fact translated as follows by the Septuagint. Kai cardia ton astenunton prosexei tu aquein, kai ai glossai ai psellizusai tacu, matheson tailaleien eirenen. Tzachot elsewhere indicates something bright and or torrid, shining, and or white. As the labor of the translations shows, the term must have appeared in the Vorlage of the Septuagint. In any case, speaking here must mean speaking correctly, clearly. As can be seen, the second hemistic, with the only additional presence of taku, formularly follows the athetized third column of 29-24. Hence, the reasonable hypothesis that it was interpolated from here to there, even if we have rarely asked ourselves why. However, the translation here, as in the previous verses mentioned, is not entirely literal. So much so that both Symmachus, as attested by the aforecited Eusebius, and Jerome, felt compelled to bring the wording at least partially closer to the Hebrew. The former with cardia de anoeton, tacunonton, even better, Aquila and Theodotion, synesei gnonai, glossa de traulon, tacunei lalein trana. Tranos Aquila, Craugas, curiously, Theodotion, who perhaps intended to translate tzakot with a corresponding feminine plural, understanding the return to speech as a regained ability to shout. The latter, Jerome, with et cor stultorum intelliget scientiam et lingua balborum velociter loquetur et plane. In the first part of the verse, the breathless asti, nimcharim, participle nifal from the root of hast, worry, and restlessness, are certainly interpreted in light of the nimchare lev, the restless of earth, idest of spirit, of 35:4, Isaiah 35:4, who are told, be strong, it's cool, do not fear. Hence the rendering here with ton astenunton, a term in which physical, psychological, and moral weakness can coexist. And the semantically meaningful predicate group yabin ledat, in which the verb of intelligence and pay attention bin, compared already Deuteronomy 32:7, the locus similis aforecited, takes on meaning of being capable of with lamed plus infinitive, is intelligently rendered with prosexei to akuein, whereby the knowing of Hebrew becomes, through exegesis, a listening, bringing together once again the physical and moral spiritual spheres. In the second part, in addition to syntactically reformulating the subject singular noun plus specification, plural noun, group of Hebrew, lashon illegim, into a plural noun with an adjectival participle, glossai psellithusai, the Septuagint correctly interpreted the apax illeg in light of the context of the restored good, because it is clear that the tongue that will speak clearly, next to that of children, which would not imply any messianic intervention, or of the mute, always recognizably il mim in Hebrew, see precisely with the tongue, Isaiah 35:5, lashon illeg, can only be that of stutterers. And even in this case, physical stuttering can imply a moral one, exactly as happens with the listening in the immediately preceding segments, verse 3 and following. An impossible versional challenge, on the other hand, was represented by the expression temacher ledaber tzachot, in which the verb etymologically echoes the previous one, nimcharim, and the difficult final noun, tzachot, seems ill-suited to speaking. Understandably, giving up on reproducing the etymological play, I tried in Italian with something like e il cuore degli affannati sarà capace di conoscere e la lingua dei balbuzienti si affannerà a parlare chiaro. The translator extracts the sema of hast in the form of an adverb, taku, colors with learning, mathesontai, certainly comforted by the accumulation of verba intelligenti in the previous colon, the process that leads to the rediscovered word, and finally, remaining faithful to his versory exegetical strategy of combining the physical perspective with the moral spiritual one, proceeds step by step in this way. First, clearly judges it useless, tzachot, in its connection with speaking. Nor can we blame him, I think, for not having thought of Saphos or Sapha, or of Trana or Tranos, like Symmachus and Aquila, ingenious translators, precisely because they were literalists. Because the most semantically compatible value of thak here, that of leukos, was equally inusable in connection with lalein. 2. Second, replaces, guided by the overall meaning of the sentence, thakot with the isosyllabic, isotonic, isometric assonant shalom, probably mindful of passages such as the following here. Genesis 37:4, where Joseph's brothers could no longer davrole shalom, that is, speak to him peacefully or friendly, and the Greek translates more expansively with lalei nauto uden eirenikon. Or Judith 15:8, where the high priest and the elders of Israel came to idein ten iudit kai lalessai metautesse irenen. Or Psalm 27:3, where double men are stigmatized, Dovrei shalom im rehem vera bilvavam, which the Greek translates as ton lalunton eirenen metaton plesion auton kaka de entais cardiais auton. And above all, Psalm 84:9, where the Lord Yedaver Shalom lalese yeirenen for his people, and also Psalm 121:8, where the Hebrew Adavrana Shalom Bak is rendered into Greek with Elalun de Eirenen perisu. This not contemptible result, kai ai glossai ai psellitzus ai taku mathesontai lalein Eirenen, in fact, on the one hand echoes with Eirene the etymological value of shalom, wholeness, completeness, because the stammerers will speak wholly, that is, well. But, on the other hand, it recalls the words of peace and goodness of Psalm 84 and 121, so that stammering will be transformed into words of peace and goodness. Moreover, I note, if messianic justice entailed only or essentially a mere return to the physical speech of physical stutterers, it would produce an undoubtedly positive and welcome effect, but perhaps a little too small, a little too subdimensioned compared to expectations. And if the koinetic lalein is not found in connection with Eirene except in the conspicuous patristic tradition from Irenaeus, Origen, to Gennadius Scholarius, for over 100 occurrences, especially in relation to the Psalms, the Junctura legein Eirenen, even with the limited military value of peace, is already Demosthenic, 8599, and so on, which perhaps makes the calque a little less jarring. Sealing the brief section on the righteous king, which follows the curses against Assyria, 30, 27, 31, 9, and precedes those against the women of Jerusalem, 32, 9, 14, the elaborate Greek formulation was then used without the contextual taku as a closure also for the more extended pericope on the triumph of right, also set between the vus on Jerusalem, 29, 114, and those for the rebellious embassies, 31:17. The presence of upakuein and akuein, respectively, at the end of the previous colon may have facilitated the epinoia that produced the semi-formulaic refrain, aimed at making explicit the connection between triumphant justice and the just and wise king. La doppia traduzione che risulta dall'inserzione di 32.4 in 29.24, Marco Settembrini writes to me, consente quindi di esplicitare la natura della lezione appresa. Ora si dice pace, mentre in 29.24 si bisbigliava oppressi dall'assedio. Ole Pravets astutely suggest that in 29:24 the translator may have exchanged lekak with alak, or found it so in the Forlage. Alak, which occurs in 30:10, can mean smooth, flattering, and is associated with verba dicendi. Intelligent guess. Isaiah Septuagint makes exchanges of this kind. But in the second column of 29-24, he translates LXX in any case. And as under the righteous king, the lost of earth, the same as in Isaiah 35:4, will learn to understand, and the stammerers to speak peace, so too in the triumph of justice, the misguided of spirit will know intelligence, the grumblers will learn to listen, and the stammerers, who on the moral spiritual level basically coincide with the grumblers, to talk peace. It is almost as if to say that right listening, physical and spiritual, and right speech, physical and spiritual, are both necessary outputs of the triumph of justice. The parallelistic double translation thus achieved for 29-24, double translation intercommata, which betrays the verbum, but in my opinion not the verum of the original, seem in this way to suggest a messianic reconstitution not only of intelligence, but also of speech, on the passive level of listening, as well as on the active level of voice, in the sign of peace. In this case, according to von Rad classification, von Rad 2000, 33-35, it would be a synthetic parallelism. Such a Zusatz could not in any case be surprising in Isaiah Septuagint. Similar cases of Greek addition, which Ziegler 1983 does not expunge, are numerous. To give just a few scattered examples, and only from the Proto-Isaiah, no, I have no time, so here are what you can see. One could also continue with the Deutero and try to Isaiah. Outside of Isaiah, a perhaps similar case among the numerous double translations that could be cited from that book, and for which I renvoie to Cuppi, to the Cuppi studies, is in Proverb 12:10a, Yodea tzadik nefesh behemto, dikaios oiktirei psykas ktenon autu, and 27:23a, Yado teda pne sonka, gnostos epignos psykas poimnio su, where the Septuagint seem to transfer the psykas from the first passage to the second. Perhaps a comparable intratextual integration based on a rare term is found, for example, in Isaiah 1:14, where your fists, ayu elai letorach, becomes egenethe temoi eis plesmonen, with the adverbial expression translating the difficult torah by taking up the pleres eimi of 1/11, where the syntagm translates freely but correctly Sabati. A complete list of the numerous pluses and doubletten, usually limited to single words or expressions, and in several cases, but not always, with a link in tradition represented by Isaiah Qumran to the Targumic one, or to possible Randglossen present in the Vorlage of Isaiah Septuagint, is in Ziegler, 1934. So I conclude, it's time. Who would have carried out this reduplication and when? The translator himself, invertendo or in retractando, or a later interpolator? A clear answer to this question is obviously impossible. What can be said in light of this analysis, however, is that it was a studied and deliberate action, which in this case, more than ever, seems to rule out the overused critical philological passepartout of the intrusive gloss. But there is more. All this exegetical travail via versoria, ultimately, seems more likely to be the work of a translator, and of a translator grammaticos, sometimes struggling with a very difficult text, sometimes embarrassed and thoughtful, but with a certain penchant for the freely exegetical solution, as is often the case with the Isaiah Septuagint, rather than an interpolator. On the free exegetical creativity of the translator of Isaiah, which has sometimes even earned him a reputation for incompetence, undoubtedly disproportioned, in my opinion, and on his cultural profile, a documented, balanced judgment is found in Rossobigli, 2019. And while it is true that nothing prevents us from hypothesizing a skilled and intelligent interpolator, in fact, experience teaches us that many are, nothing prevents us from thinking that, for once, skilled and intelligent may have been the translator. Thank you very much.